This was a presentation that we gave at our summer conference last year, and we've updated it slightly, but you know, it's just kind of some experimental thoughts on revolutionary organization. So yeah, so I'm Eve from Unity and Struggle, and I'm here with Chino, also from Unity and Struggle. And we wanted to discuss a bit about revolutionary organization. And also, I think it's common among the left for people to use kind of a shorthand in terms of thinking about revolutionary organization to talk about the party form. So in this presentation, we might use both of those terms in different ways, but they sort of mean the same thing. And we can kind of dive into that a bit more. So you might be asking yourself, is this a stale-ass question? Like, haven't we been through this many times? Isn't this something that like we already have the answer to? Sorry for the disgusting picture. But honestly, the answer is no. I mean, this is something that a lot of people are coming up against. People are asking questions, you know, what kind of organization should we be building in this moment? The landscape of revolutionary politics in the US has shifted very dramatically in just a few years. Here we listed a few examples. These are all circles that are grappling with different questions of forms of organization. Some of these groups are building national formations for the first time, like the DSA. Some are struggling with how to make sense of the failure of their projects, like the ISO. And some, like the anarchists and more autonomous groupings, are seeking to tighten up coordination and more evenly and consistently share some of the lessons between projects. So a lot of these questions are coming up, but I think as Chino and I were discussing it, and other people, you know, have been discussing it, we felt that there's a lack of theoretical foundation in some of these questions. And so we kind of wanted to reroute the debate in a libertarian Marxist framework and approach the party form as a question to be solved. So on the one hand, yeah, so this is, yeah, just like a sense of some of the different questions. In the interest of time, I actually am only going to look at one side of this. So that's like the Marxist-Leninists, you know, making sense of the disillusion of some of these groups, what's happening in Marxist Center, etc. And I'm not really going to go into the anarchist and autonomous left. And that's something that should be done at some point, but I think we're just going to have to leave that for another time. So first, yeah, we need to sort of clarify some key theoretical and methodological points. So what sets apart Unity and Struggle from some different tendencies is our understanding of Marx's conception of autonomy and freedom. It's a libertarian Marxist framework, and we base our understanding of Marxism in social relations and the shifting nature of social relations as the only constant element in the development of human history. So these social relations give rise to various categories of understanding, like form and content, subject and object, and the fetish. So these are three tools that I'm going to use throughout this presentation to discuss, you know, the party form and sort of our understanding of how to approach this question. I'm also going to use some visual cues, FYI, and I'll kind of point them out as we go, just to kind of touch back on them as we, you know, as we discuss these different tools. So starting with form and content, for Marx, social relations can be thought of as an ever-changing content that mediates or interacts with different forms. In turn, these forms mediate or interact with a content. So one example I found helpful for thinking about this is a balloon. So you fill a balloon with water, with a water content. The form of the balloon grows and stretches, and eventually the form can no longer hold the content. If you add more and more water, then the balloon stretches and it breaks. And so the water must be placed in a jar. The jar starts to overflow, and then the water must be placed in a bathtub, etc. Analogy, it gets a little out of hand, okay? Like, you know, eventually we have the whole ocean, but you get the point. The historical movement of the content gives rise to new forms, which in turn facilitate the contents movement. So this idea of form and content is important when we're talking about revolutionary organization. For us, revolutionary organization is a form that's mediated by content and vice versa. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. but this is my visual cue, this like overflowing bucket of water. It looks like a really good party for him. Related to form and content is Marx's conception of the relationship between subject and object. So for Marx, there's an objective world outside of us imposing certain restrictions and opportunities upon us. And as we face these certain objective conditions, we assert our subjective will onto these conditions, changing them and changing ourselves in the process. So, like form and content, the two interact with one another. So my example for this in terms of how to sort of, I don't know, understand this concept in a fun way is through the classic film, The Never-Ending Story. Can I just get a shout out of anybody who's seen this film?
Yeah.
Okay, that's not enough. Okay, that's like a couple of hesitant yes. I feel like everybody needs to like probably pause this right now and go watch that film and then come back. But anyway, so in this film, okay, so the premise of the film is that this kid Bastian finds a book, and through reading it, he's introduced to the protagonist Atreyu. And at one point in Atreyu's adventures, he comes upon an oracle in the form of a mirror that's supposed to show him his true self. Atreyu, the subject, confronts the mirror, the object, and the mirror reveals Bastian. So in that moment, Atreyu and Bastian confront each other as both objects and subjects. A whole world of objective social relations is revealed, and Atreyu and Bastian are connected, and each interaction one has with the world around them affects the other. It gets really meta. And then there's Falkor who watches it all go down, but that's a side note. The subject-object dialectic expresses not only how we interact with the world in a single moment as a single individual, but also the whole world of total social relations. It's how we can understand the unfolding human history. And this is my visual cue, yes. So for example, capitalism is both objective and subjective. So on the one hand, it's a force that stands against us. We can't simply choose not to go to work or just take everything we need. On the other hand, it is us who, by collectively choosing to go to work every day, are remaking capitalism. We're the ones who create the system every minute of every day, and if we all just made a different choice, the system would grind to a halt. But people's objective conditions shape our consciousness, so it's a sort of a push and pull to win people over to the so-called choice to just tear the shit down. In applying this question to the party form, we have to approach the working class as simultaneously objective and subjective, meaning the working class both creates the world around it and is mediated by the world around it. As the working class moves, it will interact with its conditions, shaping the conditions and itself at the same time. So we'll come back to this again too. Right now I'm still kind of building up these theoretical tools. So the last tool that I want to discuss is Marx's conception of the fetish. And as much as I wish I was actually talking about more fun aspects of fetishism, it's actually a really technical term, but just for fun, I'm still going to use a visual cue that, you know, keeps things light. So Marx, in Capital Volume 1, in Chapter 1, Marx calls the fetish the fantastic form of a social relationship between things and a material relationship between people. So something that's a social phenomenon becomes material. For Marx, this happens in the moment of exchange. Exchange under capitalism is a completely arbitrary thing, something that humans came up with. So there's nothing natural or pre-existing before humans about how to exchange, for example, like my Nalgene, which is this like water bottle, for, I don't know, Chino's cup of coffee that he's drinking right now. So, I mean, can you imagine if dinosaurs were attempting to exchange Nalgenes for coffee? Like if they, you know, let's say that dinosaurs could have Nalgenes and coffee, but it doesn't make any sense, right? There's no sort of natural thing involved in this form of exchange. It's something that humans made up. But in this moment of exchange, a whole rich history is drawn up. So, Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to show this video like as I'm talking, so you can kind of see what I'm saying. So if you think about, you know, all of the human history behind this one Nalgene, it's, you know, it's a lot more than just like a single, you know, piece of plastic. People cooperated, people were exploited, people labored. If you think about the roads that I traveled on, the parts, the materials, the millions of people, an entire social history is represented in a single object. Yet this social act appears within the material fiber of this one Nalgene and its relationship to the cup of coffee. So this social act appears to be a material object. There's something inherent in the plastic of this Nalgene that makes it worth Tino's coffee or $20 or whatever it is. And then all of these people and the social relations just appear as material. This applies to the whole world of commodities, from things that are really useful and that we use every day to things that are really esoteric and maybe not so useful. Either way, they're given a social meaning that is hidden behind a material object. In the moment of exchange, every one of these objects represents human social relations, objective conditions and subjective acts, a form and a content in metabolism, but contorted and manipulated and trapped inside of a single object. If we understand the fetish, sorry, let me go back to that. If we understand the fetish, then we'll emphasize human social relations as the key aspect of capitalism. So for revolutionary organization, the goal is to transform social relations and not just win a thing or collect as many people as possible. Okay, so to summarize the party form, it's mediated by content. It approaches the working class as both subjective and objective, and it emphasizes social relations. So now that we have our theoretical tools, we can start to approach the party as a question to be solved. But first, I wanted to go back to the Marxist-Leninist framework and look at some usual answers that people come up with to answer the party form question. So let's pause here for a second. Let's look at Marxist-Leninism. What are some experiences that you all have had with Marxist-Leninists or left parties like the ISO or Workers' World Party, PSL, RCP, the alphabet soup of parties? What are some different experiences people have had?
Like I've met a lot of vanguardist emails that are like, yeah, let's create a centralized party that can like create the path of revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've met a lot of folks in like alphabet soup type organizations that will put forth that like they have the position or their organization has figured out the position or the correct line on a number of questions.
Yeah.
Comes off often as like really dogmatic and unshaking, or like unshakable or something. And often my interactions have been like they're trying to convince me of that correct line or position, and that having that level of like theoretical unity with them is really important if we're to like continue to work together or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's presented as like, here's the scientific formula that we have figured out, and this is the only way that revolution can be realized within our current context.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't believe this, then you're reactionary.
Mm-hmm.
I think those things are definitely real with PSL and Workers' World in Atlanta, but my main experience with them has been just showing up for our work and doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I work with a community anti-gentrification group.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is Kate. This is B. I work with lots of folks in the labor movement who are Marxist-Leninists of various stripes. I would say just one different thing to add is that when they're showing up and doing the work, when I've asked about why, it's been that they're really looking for advanced folks, working class people, to eventually recruit to the party. So yes, they do the work. They usually do it really well. But when I've gotten into really deep political discussions, I've realized that the reason and I've seen it in their and some unwillingness to kind of work with people who have been socialized by capitalism in a certain way and don't have the proper line on things, like, but that it would take time, that I'm sort of interested in investing in, because I find it especially important to kind of move people that have a very different politics, but who are working class or who've never had the opportunity to engage with this kind of politics. There's been a dismissal of them and like a desire to work with the so-called advanced and eventually to recruit them.
Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add?
They often just point to a particular piece that Lenin wrote, and they're like, if you just read this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm hearing a lot of, some critical things, but then also, some props, to people who show up and do the work. And I think like our method is not to, just like have a sectarian approach, like just because they're in a party, we can't work with them, or, we disagree theoretically. And so, about like something that happened in 1917. So like we can't, work together. But what we're trying to do with this presentation is really illuminate the political disagreements and, just make clear that, we're coming from different perspectives so that we can understand what these methods are and where their limitations are in practice. So some of the things that I'm hearing, there's some dogmatism, some, focus on theory that is maybe like sort of inorganically imposed upon people, a sense that like everybody needs to be recruited to the party, and that's sort of, the way that revolution happens is like people join this party that they've created, that they have all the correct answers. So let's investigate this a little bit further. So for many Marxist-Leninist groups, the starting point is Lenin, as somebody mentioned. So there's no attempt to root the organization question in a Marxist framework, but rather an imposition of the lessons of what is to be done onto a very different moment. So in this way, Marxist-Leninists are disregarding the relationship between form and content, disrupting the relationship between subject and object, and trapping themselves in the fetish. So allow me to explain. For Marxist-Leninists, forms are static objects that can be moved around in place and time. So what Lenin argued for in What is to be Done, and what was one particular experience of Bolshevism, is the end-all be-all of the party question. There's a one-size-fits-all to the party form that includes democratic centralism, a theoretical journal or newspaper, a correct party line that the cadre must use to unite the vanguard, and the party will grow in a linear fashion, and all workers must join the party. Without the party, there's no revolution, and the party is necessary for revolution. And all of these movements inevitably lead to the party. So there's no shift from the balloon to the bucket. There's just an imposition of the balloon throughout history. But with our handy-dandy understanding of form and content, we can create something different. Remember that the activities that people do and the social relationships that they form are the content that shapes different forms. So for example, many Marxist-Leninists argue that democratic socialism is the form that will sort of level up the working class. So inside the party, there's this rich and internal theoretical debate, a decision, and then the members are bound by this decision. This is all well and good for getting shit done, but it doesn't take into consideration the various needs and wants and desires of the working class and the people in these organizations, and how these are expressed in various forms. Chino's going to actually talk a little bit more about this, so we can touch back on it, and we can touch more on our sort of positive vision for this. But I just threw out a couple of examples of counterpositions to democratic centralism that are more rooted in Marxist conception of form and content. Approaching the party as a question shaped by our moment, experimenting with forms that the class throws up, and engaging in theory making that reflects the times and the life of working class people, including through popular culture, and approaching party building as one project of many. Similarly, what Marxist-Leninists emphasize is the objectivity over the subjectivity of the working class. So in Lenin's What is to be Done, he argues that revolutionary consciousness is brought to the working class from a cadre group above and beyond it. In this sense, the working class is an object to be acted upon, and revolutionary consciousness is something that the party doles out. So working class people are like the mirror, just passively confronted by Atreyu, but never asserting our will upon Atreyu, shaping him in the process and ourselves in the process. Okay, my nerdy metaphors are a bit too much, but you get the point. The point is that if you're treated like an object, and the party form is the subject existing outside of people's everyday choices and experiences, it doesn't really matter what the working class is doing as long as they're plugged in like literal objects into the party form. Again, all signs point to the party. But for us, these sentiments are partially true, but they're missing one and very important side of a dialectic. For us, revolutionary consciousness is subjective, meaning when we create the world around us, we are creating the opportunities and limitations of revolution, and therefore a revolutionary party form. And this all culminates in a lack of understanding of the fetish. For Marxist-Leninists, in treating the working class as objects, it flattens our ability to fight. We become objects to be collected and counted and wheeled out when the moment is right and not a moment before. They view the process of revolution as a material question. This is why they will argue that society with redistributed wealth or goods organized and facilitated by quote-unquote communists is a socialist society. But in fact, this is an emphasis on material objects instead of social relations. And again, this method assumes that all signs lead to the party as a static form. Just as we are objects to be collected by a party subject, it's a matter of just building the party over time. But if we root the party in a libertarian Marxist method, we can reject the notion that all signs point to the party and instead view the party as a question to be solved. So in sum, we're going to reject that all signs point to the party and ask the question, how can we build, what is the party and how can we solve this question? And Chino is actually going to answer that all on his own right now.
Oh,
no, I'm kidding. But no, he has some thoughts on it.
Cool. So thanks, Eve. Thanks. The slideshow keeps going. Yeah. All right. Sweet. Cool. So my part kind of follows up on this analysis. If the party's a question, how do we go about answering it? How do you answer a question like that? In this section, so I'll highlight several ways we can kind of generate those answers. And then I'll try to offer a few myself sort of experimentally. We take it or leave it. And a theoretical tool that I'm used throughout is class composition. So real briefly, that term just refers to the ways that work and daily life are arranged under capitalism, but also how they're arranged by us as we struggle to survive and fight back, and in the process generate shared identity and organization. And the idea is like through this process, it's just continual, what the working class is gets continually made and remade. It's a concept from the Italian autonomists in the 1970s. They developed the idea, and they also argued that the party organization generally reflects the class composition that it emerges from. So they kind of historicize the vanguard party that way. And in a piece that some of us have read, like for Unity and Struggles Organization Study, Sergio Bologna, who's one of these Italians, argues that, for example, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, sort of grew organically out of the struggles of the immigrant working class in the US at the time. And so it came to reflect their sort of more flexible, mobile forms of struggle, that kind of thing. So when we apply that idea to our own context, it suggests some ways that we could answer the party question. One way is to look at how are working class communities organized, how do we organize ourselves both on the job, but also in homes, neighborhoods, schools, so on. We can look at that. We can try to imagine how, groups of coworkers, even informal work groups, in the workplace, ride shares, childcare networks, all the stuff that we invent to survive and struggle, how they could produce revolutionaries and how they could get knit together in some kind of revolutionary organization connecting many different areas of struggle. That's one way. A second way to answer the party question is to look at the kinds of organization that movements have developed in the course of big ruptures. So in moments like the Arab Spring or Standing Rock, or last year in Sudan, people suddenly find themselves having to deal with these big practical challenges, big political questions on a mass scale. Right? And especially the kinds of organization that militant minorities within those movements develop, to coordinate actions or to help clarify, like, what's this movement about and where is it going? All those are concrete attempts to solve the party question in practice. And we can observe them, we can learn from them. If we do our work right, we'll actually be in the middle of the shit, so we can kind of learn from our own experience firsthand. But we can also study. So for example, again, in our organization study, we have a piece by Rodrigo Nunes in some of his writing where he's theorizing about how movements since 2011 have organized themselves. We can read that kind of thing. We can also look at descriptive accounts of recent movements. We can read a history of organization during the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square and draw lessons from that. So there's a third way we can generate answers to the party question, and it's by far the weirdest. And this is the one I want to spend the most time on because it's experimental thinking, We can also look for clues in the way that capitalists try to organize us in workplaces or the state. And this is weird because it means basically seeing through the enemy's eyes. But it still works because the enemy depends on us to assemble the car parts and pilot the drones, So as long as we're wage laborers and can pick between different exploiters, firms are kind of compelled to satisfy some of our aspirations to get us to work within limits. And as a result, the way that capitalists bring us together to run the world for them reflects some of how we might choose to organize ourselves. So we can kind of read capitalist organization between the lines, is what I'm saying. And if we do that, we can see almost in the negative, almost in silhouette, how we might come together. It's kind of spacey. And this photo is actually, it's a great, and I'm blanking. There's a beautiful passage in this history of the Mexican Revolution about the role of locomotives, right? And the train lines have been constructed to develop the country, but during the revolution, they become the channels through which the revolutionary armies can move and crisscross the country, right? So it's a form of organization developed for capital's purposes, which gets inverted in a revolutionary upset. So we can kind of think of capitalist organization and party organization in a similar way. Okay, a caution about this. It's really, really easy when you do this to be a lazy thinker and to go, oh, that form of organization is really great. We should just keep that same energy, but put the working class in charge. And famously, that's what Lenin did with the German post office, if people have read this bit. He loved that the post office was organized by an overall plan and formal rules and procedures rather than just like the individual despotism of an owner. And he thought, well, this is a form, that's developing under capitalism, but socialist society will be just like that, but with the class in charge setting the plan, maybe the party in charge of half of the class setting the plan. So many people do a similar thing today when they imagine like, oh, overthrowing capitalism will mean basically doing cooperative businesses, just doing them everywhere. Or we'll keep, Walmart's created this great system, we'll just take it over and use it ourselves, Eve's points about form and content should suggest to us it doesn't work like that. No organizational form under capitalism can just be adopted wholesale, since all forms reflect an unstable balance between the needs of capital and the needs of the proletariat. That's a contradictory content. So anytime workers take up a form and they change this content, the form will change in turn. And when we're doing our analysis here, our job is to actually anticipate in thought what that change might look like. We're not just saying, oh, this looks good, let's take that. Okay, so with that caveat, let's take a look at some of the features of capitalist organization today and how they might flip. Many features of today's capitalism can be understood as a reaction to and an incorporation of the demands of the 60s and 70s. What did we see in those years? We saw a rebellion against the assembly line, against the racial division of labor, the nuclear family, against bureaucracy, both in the capitalist West and the state capitalist East. People demanded less alienated ways of being. That was like the gist of the Frankfurt School's critique of modernity on the level of theory. And it's what youth, especially Black youth, are doing in Vietnam when they refuse to go on missions that they don't understand or believe in, and instead they start smoking weed and killing their officers. You know, in this crisis, capitalism had to give in to some of these aspirations, these needs and demands in order to survive. So neoliberalism's response was basically to say, like, okay, you don't have to be a cog in the assembly line or in a bureaucracy or be defined by a single job your entire life anymore. Fine. Instead, what? You get to pursue your own personal fulfillment by constantly improving yourself through an endless series of precarious jobs and creative hustles. You know, and okay, like, no, your job won't, it'll no longer be just like mindless button pushing to fill a quota. Cool. Instead, it'll be based on this sense of mission that we really want you to buy into, and you'll fulfill it in this self-directed way. And we'll just like constantly evaluate you on your teamwork and productivity. Cool. And that's why all these stupid keywords we have to put in resumes now are like self-start or team player, flexible, creative. You know, it wasn't what you put in your resume in 1950. So capitalism is basically, you know, 1970s popped the balloon, right? And capitalism reimposed a balloon, admitting some of the new content within it. This shift is really pronounced, especially in the new firms that are at the cutting edge of capitalism that have like developed since the 1970s. Right? So for example, at Google, I'm in New York City, so down on 14th Street, there's a Google office, right? There, you know, aside from having like ball pits and snack bars, they allow and even encourage their workers to reconfigure their own job roles and like constantly combine in different teams, often remote teams. But it isn't only a feature of high-wage tech work. Auto manufacturers since the 80s have experimented with giving line workers the ability to stop production and oversee their own quality control. That was Nissan, I think. And even in low-wage service sector, like my mom worked at Walmart, you know, and the team language is ubiquitous. Everyone's organized in teams. It's sort of more clearly a sham there, but that's still the ideology and some of the method. So business management has completely changed since the uprising of the 60s and 70s to be about cultivating mission, encouraging group learning, using emotional intelligence, and so on. And as much as this is a trick of capitalist exploitation, it also expresses something about people's desire for meaning and autonomy and fulfillment in our labor. You know, we see similar organizational features in the state. I'll go quicker on this, but for example, the old mass parties of the early 20th century, most studies observe, you know, they really wither after the 1970s. And a recent interesting feature, there's this book about the digital party by this guy, Paulo Garbaudo, about Podemos in Spain, or on the kind of populist fascist edge, the Five-Star Movement in Italy. All of these are using online platforms with really low barriers to entry and participation, right, to link up millions of basically internet members together. Now, these forms reintroduce new kinds of populism, and they're sort of bullshit, but they also speak to people's distrust of bourgeois politics and the desire for direct, unmediated relationships with political leaders and decision-making. Sure. Last one, you know, even the US military is developing new ways of organizing. Since the 90s, different chunks of the military have adapted to adversaries, you know, certainly social movements and cartels, but also especially the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan. Especially in the ground forces, they've restructured in many ways their command. So now units provide what's called top sight to the subordinate units in the field. That's like the view from above. It was formerly only available like on a map at headquarters. Now the idea is to make it so that lower units can access that information. They've reconceived command itself to be based around more independent initiative from subordinates, while still falling within this sort of broader mission command. And Stanley McChrystal, he's the former head of the Joint Special Operations Command, He's like a poster boy of this shift. He actually wrote a book with a business management wonk about it. And to defeat the Iraqi insurgency, he established like a daily secure video call every day that brought together military command posts in Iraq and Afghanistan, US embassies from across the globe, and the intelligence agencies in DC. So it got all these units sharing information every day at 4 p.m. Baghdad time and like coordinating their intelligence. It's these new kinds of organization that wouldn't have been conceivable in 1960. So, okay, all these changes have been underway. What do we see in these organizational forms of firms, parties, and militaries that a revolutionary party might appropriate in its own way? We can use the method here that Eve outlined as a guide. We could expect movements to take up the objective conditions created by previous struggles and use them to realize the liberatory content which is expressed in this mutilated way under current capitalist forms. So I'll point out 3 possibilities as just, you know, experimental thinking. Okay, first, I think parties will increasingly become places where we kind of develop our whole selves in the course of changing the world. Old school professionalism, you know, Lenin's professional revolutionary, asked us to kind of silence parts of ourselves in service of the organization's goals. But this increasingly is going to clash with our need to develop ourselves as all-around human beings. That's a real tension, because we have to find ways to maintain disciplined unity of action and have clear political debate, while also making space for fulfillment and emotional growth, and just all the ways that we're challenged individually and interpersonally in political life. And I think UNS is kind of moving in this direction. You know, on the one hand, we're working on a strategy document around which we can have strategic debate, but we're also trying to put equal thought into crafting our political culture and how it feels personally and interpersonally to like be part of this group. Second possibility, I think parties will take up new ways of achieving unity of action. Old school parties did this, of course, by establishing like the political line and then having cadres apply them, usually under the threat of party discipline. They often did it dogmatically and formalistically. And that's become such a feature that even when we say the phrase political line, we kind of say it like we're, you know, overbearing granddads or like hitting a dog with a rolled up newspaper, you know. Sorry. A rolled up party newspaper is, okay, bad metaphor. It has that association. And I just think the class today, where revolutions will be emerging from, you know, people today will demand more self-direction than the time. And at the same time, the material conditions for mobility and communication actually exist. The parties can have a much more continuous dialogue about how a given strategy should be enacted in practice. In turn, I think this changes the role of central bodies. It's not like we lose centralization, you know, but it becomes less disciplinarian then. It's more about sharing information and facilitating discussion, so locals are equipped to like think and act independently and effectively. Oh, and I should say one way I think we'll challenge capitalist forms here is by expanding the scope of what we think about together. In a lot of the examples I described, this kind of self-directed network coordination in firms and the military and whatnot, it still takes place on mostly a tactical level. Right? It's almost empiricist. Subordinate units share these daily impressions of what works and doesn't work, and they tweak stuff. But they aren't asking big questions about where we're going and why. That still gets set by the CEOs and the generals. And that's why actually in a lot of their management literature, they celebrate the crowd behavior of birds or ants and the swarming talk, flocking, you know, because they can improvise solutions to complex problems without higher order thinking. But for a revolutionary group, the point is to do higher order thinking. It's to figure out where we're going and why and craft our strategy accordingly. And old style parties did this in specific venues, like debates at congresses or kind of these heavy debates among the party leadership or in their theoretical journals. But I think today it'll just be a much more continuous feature of how we work. And Unity and Struggle does that right now in different venues, you know, through our calls, our yearly conference, different online forums. Okay, last thing, And following from these points, I think parties will also express new styles of leadership. And I mean this both in terms of how leadership bodies function within parties and how the party offers leadership to the class as a whole. In many old school parties, political lines were kind of generated among the leadership and didactically drilled into the rank and file, and then, like somebody says, like communicated to the class like it's this like immortal science that you have to accept because it's given as true. And this is also partly because of the like objectivist, mechanistic version of Marxism that became standard after the Soviet Union, but that's too much to get into here. But that's a feature. Today, I think leadership will be much more about listening and synthesizing and advising. You know, parties will probably survey and analyze the experiences of the broader class struggle. They'll synthesize something that's less like, you know, a disciplinary political line and more like guidelines or best practices. And part of what they do will be to advise local chapters and groups that are totally autonomous, not part of the party, advise them on how these guidelines or best practices could be implemented in a specific context. And even that's a little bit different from how leadership happens in today's networky social movements. You know, from what I see, I don't know what others have seen, but many groups today treat leadership as sort of like tactical branding. So Occupy Wall Street or like Cosecha or something might establish specific actions, specific practices or slogans that they want others to reproduce. And they kind of work to popularize that with their own exemplary actions. We might do a similar thing at times, but that's still an approach of like little groups dispersed in networks trying to do easily reproducible tactical things and inspire each other. I'd suggest that with these new forms of party organization, we're aiming at something that's a little richer and has a richer kind of leadership in turn. You know, it's one that features like ongoing discussion about what kind of strategy we're doing, and that's synthesizing broad experiences in the class struggle, and which is actively trying to help others think and apply these things in their own context. So, whew. Yeah, that was, sorry, that was a lot of stuff, but thank you everyone.